Okay, let's begin.
Good morning, Patriot listeners. Thank you for tuning into Political Pitchforks, a new show on AM 1280 The Patriot, now airing every Saturday morning from 9 to 10 a.m. Every week, Political Pitchforks will bring you candid talk about state and national issues that impact the rights endowed upon us by our Creator and what our elected leaders are doing to protect and defend these liberties. Links to content about these issues can be found on our website at politicalpitchforks.com. I am Susan Shogren Smith, longtime conservative, hoping to join others who love our country. And I'm here with Jeremy Munson. Jeremy's highly respected political strategist. I thank him for joining us this morning. And Jeremy, I'd like to kick it over to you for an update about yourself and also what's going on in the Israel-Iran conflict.
Yeah, Susan, thanks for having me on again. For the listeners who don't know me, Jeremy Munson, I've served 3 terms in the Minnesota House of Representatives and been a longtime political activist, and I'm chair of the Republican Liberty Caucus, which is an affiliate of the Republican Party. Also, you and I are both state central delegates, so we're deeply involved in Republican politics. In the news this week, obviously, we have to address what happened yesterday, which is 2 days ago now, which is the attack from Israel on Iran. Americans, a lot of people are calling it a preemptive or a defensive strike. They bombed nuclear facilities, took out major military commanders and top brass of Iran, and they're doing this to basically knock down their nuclear capabilities, and it's going to escalate into a pretty serious conflict that I'm hoping that Americans stay out of. At least I am, and a portion of the conservatives are hoping to stay out of this. We have people like Lindsey Graham who are on the opposite side of the Republican Party than I am, who have been championing this, get involved and bomb the crap out of Iran for so long. But we're seeing this divide play out on social media, especially between the two factions within the Republican Party, the pro-war and the anti-war America First groups.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about this issue because we know that for Republicans, Israel is really often just almost a sacred entity that must be protected at all costs. And then there are people who are really strict following of the idea that in order for America to engage in an international conflict, there should be a war declared by the Senate. There should be really clear identification of specific American interests of why we're getting involved before we get involved. And the people, for example, who say out of Ukraine, you would expect the same people to say stay out of Israel-Iran. But this is creating a ton of tension because our politicians are really tied in politically and financially with AIPAC, and maybe you want to address that.
Well, certainly. I mean, the AIPAC, which is a political action committee funded by Israel or supporters of Israel, donates, hundreds of millions of dollars to congressional candidates directly or spends money on their behalf in elections as an independent expenditure. And Thomas Massie, who I believe represents probably my views most in Congress, he does take a stand against, against funding for Israel, thinking that they can defend themselves. We shouldn't be giving them more money. And then AIPAC, this political action committee funded by Israel, comes out and spends, tens of millions of dollars against him in a primary. It's a very powerful voice in DC. And there's on Twitter, there's a group that posts how much AIPAC spends on elections for congressmen. And when they go out and share their, put out a statement on this Israeli conflict, that they retweet them and post how much money that AIPAC donated to their election campaign. And sometimes it's, over $1 million over the years. But the United States has given Israel over $250 billion in military aid over the decade since the 1970s, when we started giving them direct financial support. I think a lot of people would agree that Israel has the means, the capability to engage in war with their neighbors without sending American servicemen over there, or for the United States military to take a direct, stance in the war, because we don't want to bring more terrorists from Iran into our country to bomb us because of our actions in this war. I think we should be taking an America first position and just not being involved in this.
Right. Yeah, I just really think there has to be a path for America to stand with Israel in their right to defend themselves and protect themselves. And an example I would use would be if I'm standing on my front porch and somebody's standing in my street and tells me, or a neighbor across the street says to me, I'm coming for you. I'm going to kill you and your family and make sure your house is blown up. Well, I'm now put on notice that they're coming. Now, if they stay in their house and I don't see any signs of it, I'm still on notice. But if they start coming out of their house and they have a rocket launcher and they're coming at my house, at what point do I have the right to then am I still on defense, or when do I go on offense, right? When do I become the aggressor? And if they're staying in their house, but we know this is the problem Israel has, right? That we know there are a group of people, countries, that openly say that their plan is to destroy Israel. And we saw what happened to Israelis, a little over a year ago, right? And it was horrific what happened. So for us as a people to really look at, when is Israel rightly defending itself and protecting itself from what they know to be an imminent assault that's coming? And how do we as Americans stand by them in a way that encourages them to always be responsible in the choices they make, to limit their aggression to necessary aggression? And I think these are really hard discussions for us to have, because when we ever start talking about it, depending on who you're talking to in the Republican circle of people, that there are just some people that refuse to acknowledge there should be any limitation on Israel at all.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I don't know the intelligence in this. I don't, Israel has awesome intelligence gathering capabilities. They know whether there was an attack imminent from Iran. I support their right to do what they did, and I think that as long as they keep these bombings strategic, to take out, specific facilities or specific people, and they don't use cluster bombs, which Israel has historically used, which are bombs that explode with lots of little bombs that then explode again and take out, have caused massive civilian casualties. As long as they are, doing things above board, in declaring war and defending themselves, I support their ability to do this. I just don't want Americans to be dragged into this conflict. One of the sticky points here is that so many Israelis have U.S. citizenship. They have dual citizenship, which I feel like we shouldn't be recognizing it. You choose a country that you want to be a citizen of. You
totally
don't get to
agreed.
carry our passports. We saw this a couple of years ago when there was an attack in Israel, and so many that were claiming he was a U.S. citizen, and they were kind of an Israeli citizen first, happened to be born here, so they also got U.S. citizenship, but went back to Israel, and then they talk about American citizens being killed. I think that the defense or that the State Department should issue an evacuation of
Hmm.
all American citizens from Israel and get them out, help them
I agree.
come back to the United States. If they want to stay and declare, look, they're Israeli first, not American citizens, then we shouldn't be dragged into a war if these dual citizens are killed, and because there likely will be Israeli casualties of dual citizenship people, and that's one way that we could get dragged into the war, is if we have American citizens being attacked, right?
Right. Yeah, this is a serious issue, and I think our government should be honest with all Americans, saying if you choose to stay, be prepared for the harm that could come your way. I totally agree. Well, I think as we wrap up this segment, after the break, Political Pitchforks will be back to discuss the expected, mostly peaceful protests that will be coming to Minnesota this weekend starting today, with the No Kings progressive movement that is launching their effort in Minnesota. So we'll be back shortly.
Okay, let's begin.
Welcome back, Patriots. This is Susan Shogren Smith here with Jeremy Munson. We're on Political Pitchforks, a new program that airs every Saturday morning on AM Patriot 1280 from 9 to 10 a.m. So, Jeremy, let's talk today about these political hotspots we're hearing about in Minnesota. There's hundreds of organizations from across the country, funded by taxpayers, sadly, and also some well-known billionaires. And they are encouraging these extremist progressives to demonstrate on behalf of what is now being phrased. There's a website called the new movement, the No Kings movement, No Kings, and that is beginning today in Minnesota. So I'm just wondering if you're planning on joining in their efforts to stop the Kings.
Yeah, Susan, I am so excited that all these protests are out there protesting kings because I hate kings. I love having a constitutional republic, limited government, small government. And I was out there protesting against Tim Walz and Keith Ellison during COVID, during the lockdowns in front of his mansion several times, wearing my T-shirt that said, "My governor is not a king," right? Because Tim Walz and Keith Ellison were writing laws unilaterally without the legislature, right? I was a legislator. I didn't get to weigh in on this. Right. They were writing laws. They were jailing people, fining people based on these new laws that they wrote. And so I was absolutely against kings and this, consolidation of power. Unfortunately, this is not that movement. This is like Democrat socialists who are upset about Trump enforcing immigration laws and are using Trump's actions in California to just implement this nationwide protest, which it is so organized. If you go out to the No Kings website, nokings.org, you can read about this movement, see the probably 1,000 protests across the country. There's at least a dozen, maybe 24 of them scheduled in Minnesota. And if you go to their partners link or go to nokings.org/partners, you'll see a list of over 100 nonprofits, including the Sierra Club, some banks for federal workers, and a bunch of other groups. Of course, Planned Parenthood is there too. And what they try to do with these Democrat protests is they gather all of these different disparate causes, right? The Sierra Club, what do they care about, protests in California? They're climate activists. They're taking all these groups, the LGBTQ, Schwab umlaut group. They're taking the climate activists. They're taking the people that, the Antifa groups, Black Lives Matters there. They get everybody together and they just cram them into one single protest and then just kind of just roundtable of anger and just give them a reason to go out. Now, I just bought my second Tesla last week, so I'm glad they're not burning down Tesla dealerships or damaging cars, but they're just angry and they want to get out and protest, and they call it the No Kings movement. But the sad thing is that Tim Walz and Keith Ellison, the people I was protesting against for being kings, trying to be kings, they're actually speaking at this event in Minnesota.
Well, Tim Walz was asked about that, whether or not he was going to be participating yesterday when he was getting grilled by some legislators. And he said he didn't know that he was going to be participating. And then, of course, they discussed with him the fact that there was actually an agenda that was posted online, and pretty clear the organizers think he's going to be there. So I guess we're going to find out soon today if he's actually going to be there. I think he's going to be there. I think he's going to be there, and I think he's going to have a lot to say about no kings, except himself, the king, which he would like to continue to be the king of Minnesota. And we're going to have an important election coming up. I think these organizations that you're talking about are fascinating, these partners. And one of the things that is hard for, I think, most people don't pay a lot of attention to the minutia of what's happening. And so when they hear the name of an organization, that sounds so wonderful, right? Like if you look on their website, you have care in action. Care. These are people who care, and they're acting to care for people. It sounds nice, right? Community change. And we have all these great Fair Share America, the Faithful America, these organizations with these wonderful names that are actually probably the exact opposite of what they're actually doing, right? That their missions are not about caring about people. They're about pushing a movement. And certainly when we talk about kings and tyranny, which is what really most kings have the ability to enforce upon their people, tyranny, and monarchies of the past engaged in feudalism, where the people were simply serfs and slaves, and basically had to pay to live and to survive. We now are living in a world where that's how people are. They'd like to move us. These same people would like to move us all to 15-minute cities, and make us rely on not cars but public transportation to go anywhere. And they don't want you to travel across the country and see how great this country really is and how beautiful it is, right? They want to teach you a narrative of it's terrible, and they're literally leading the way to tyranny in America. And these protests that we're going to have in Minnesota have put a lot of people on edge, and there's a lot of people very afraid that just the mere mention of these gatherings is stoking fear in the hearts of average people who remember 2020 and the fires and the burning and the billions of dollars of damage done in Minnesota. People who had businesses for decades in locations, who coincidentally, all of those people had provisions in their leases that if they were destroyed by fire or burned, they couldn't rebuild there. They had to move their business. And so these fires all made way for a total transformation of the economic conditions in those little communities, the suburbs, the places in St. Paul, et cetera. And so the tyranny that exists is here. It's with us already with the DFL trifecta.
Right. I want to touch on a point that you made in your intro about taxpayer money going to these protests. If you look at the list of partners that are participating and supporting this protest movement today, not just the ACLU, but Americans for Tax Fairness. There's a bunch of different Jewish action groups that are involved in this. Catholics for Common Good.
Right.
Like there's a bunch of different groups, and in so many of these organizations receive taxpayer funds. Now, it's not necessarily earmarked directly for protests like this, but somebody was posting how many millions of dollars from various state legislatures go to these organizations that are in turn turning around and supporting these protests today. And this is the type of stuff that Democrats are really good at. They set up a nonprofit and raise money from state legislatures and then turn around and use it to either get out the vote for their candidates. So they turn a nonpartisan thing into a highly partisan cause. And we saw that during the 2020 races too, where there's a lot of races. The riots was that a lot of those organizations that were supporting those groups were receiving taxpayer funds, or in the private sector, corporations were donating, like Target and like all the major corporations were donating to the Black Lives Matter movement, and then that money was either wasted, embezzled, or really was tied to some of these destructive riots that were happening across the country. There's a group called the Center for Biological Diversity, and it has a frog on there. Like, I don't know what they are, where their skin is in the game here, but whoever's donating to that group, and we could, dig in sometime and figure it out, they should know that their money is being spent on these protests and potentially these riots they may happen today.
Well, and they may have inadvertently identified an actual serious issue, that there are frogs now living in our rivers that actually have been genetically transformed due to the toxins, potentially due to some of the birth control that ends up in our water system, that they literally are changing the biology of animals. So they probably actually don't want to talk about some of those issues that they accidentally might have mentioned. So I think that's actually sort of funny that you bring that up. I want to say on their website, this No Kings group, it's very interesting. It says they've defied our courts, deported Americans, disappeared people off the streets, and attacked our civil rights and slashed our services. And they may believe that that's true, those things. But actually, what we have is a government right now that's trying to reassert the law as being relevant and meaningful. So when you come into this country illegally and live in America, that doesn't make you an American. It makes you a tourist who's overstayed your welcome, and now you need to go, right? At best. At worst, you're just intentionally violating the laws of America, ignoring the fact that we have a border, utilizing resources to the detriment of taxpayers who are following the law, and that this issue, what they're convoluting here is facts. I don't know how many people they're disappearing off the streets when they arrest them for committing a violation of our law, they're not disappearing them like you would think of the communists taking them into a back alley and shooting them in the head and throwing them in a river. They are arresting them and putting them into a process to lead to deportation, right? Slashing services, our services. The federal government is supposed to only enact laws that are for the common good, not the specific good. They're not supposed to be redistributing wealth to fund programs at a federal level where we literally take billions and billions of dollars from taxpayers across the country, send it to Washington, D.C., where we can fund millions of jobs so that we can then have those people in those jobs redistribute some of that money back to the states to do the things that the states were always responsible for based on their own interests that they choose. So it's interesting that our services, right? So I know as we come to a close, Jeremy, I don't know if you want to wrap anything up quick.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, for the listeners, if you're attending the protests or you drive by or you want to go to a counter protest against the No Kings movement, I'd love to hear from you on your experience. You can reach out to Susan. You could reach out to me on Facebook. You can find me at facebook.com/Representative Jeremy Munson, or you can search my name out on Facebook, find me, message me through the page, or comment on my posts with pictures or commentary from these protests today around Minnesota.
So I want to thank you for listening. And after this break, Political Pitchforks will be back. We've got a couple of interesting issues. One is a proposed constitutional amendment that will help ensure voters across Minnesota will know what they're voting for and what our politicians are voting for in our omnibus bills right now, which are basically a big black hole secret. So we'll be back in a few minutes. So we thank you for listening to Political Pitchforks.
Okay, let's begin.
Welcome back, Patriots. This is Susan Shogren Smith with Jeremy Munson on Political Pitchforks. We have a lot still left to talk about this morning, including omnibus bills, a constitutional amendment to limit bills to a single subject, and a lawsuit filed by the Gun Owners Caucus that is now moving through the state courts. So, Jeremy, why don't we start with the omnibus bills? So, what do you think?
Well, when I talk to people about changing government, as I'm a change agent, I love to go in and look at the mess that is government and try to propose a solution to make government more efficient. And when you get up to St. Paul as a legislator and you start digging into figuring out why government grows so much, the root cause of the growth of government is multi-subject omnibus bills. And it was really sad to see people who are for or against a specific bill, and they get their legislator to introduce it, they track it through, it gets assigned a committee, they come to the committee, they wear a t-shirt that says, pass this bill or whatever. The bill gets its hearing, but they don't actually vote on the bill. It gets laid over in committee for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. And people are like, what is this? Well, all these hundreds of bills that get assigned to the health committee or the transportation committee get packaged into this one enormous bill. And it might be 1,000 pages long that includes 300 underlying bills. And then if that's not bad enough, sometimes the health bill gets combined with the transportation bill. And so you have, many hundreds of bills rolled into one, or the agriculture gets combined with broadband and in rural economic development or whatever. And they combine all these things together. And the purpose of that is because they try to find good bipartisan legislation that most people can agree with, and then they start attaching all this other junk to it. And if they want to buy votes of certain legislators, they're like, I'm not voting for that. Well, we'll take that bill that you introduced at the beginning of the session that nobody really wants, and we'll attach it to the omnibus bill. Now you have to vote for it, because voting against it would be voting against your own bill. And we'll tell all your constituents that you voted against, research on, orphan dolphins or whatever your bill was. And that won't look good on a mailer. So then they end up voting for it. So this is how government grows, is that they get all these bills that would never be able to pass on their own merits, and they package them together. And the worst part about this is that all the lobbyists and special interest groups in Minnesota that write most of the legislation, they know that cramming their bill into this that most people wouldn't be able to ballot voting for, it'll just glide through on these huge omnibus bills. The good news is Minnesota's Constitution requires that every bill be a single subject.
Right.
Because the founders knew that the majority party in the legislature would log roll the minority by forcing them to vote for some portion of the bill and get their entire thing through. But the problem is that the legislators don't follow the Constitution, and there's very few out there that are actually voting against these huge omnibus bills like they should. So strengthening the single subject clause of our Constitution is important. What happened was once the bills became so big that if a court, courts, people could challenge it. It's tough to get standing to prove you have standing or
Right.
that you're being harmed by this. And when the courts rule in their favor and they would overturn these bills, large portions of government would be shut down because they would lose funding. And in fact, in one case, the Supreme Court said that they couldn't overturn this huge omnibus bill because all of the funding for the Minnesota Supreme Court was in it.
Right.
By voting for it, they would shut themselves down.
So I think this right here, I want to touch on this issue because the courts are bound to follow the Constitution of the United States and Minnesota. There's just no question about that. And all of the rules require, all the rules, federal, state, doesn't matter, all rules that bind the courts require those courts to apply the plain language meaning of the words in the Constitution, right? And this section, which is Section 17 of Article 4 of the Minnesota Constitution, it's this simple. No law, so no law, that means none, zero laws, right? Shall embrace, that means no law can embrace. That means all laws have, right? More than one subject, which shall be expressed in its title. This is the most simple, clear section, potentially in this entire Constitution. Like it just, if you had first graders read that sentence, they would say, well, the laws can only talk about one thing and they have to say what they're talking about at the very beginning. That's it. I mean, there's no confusion about it. And the courts have failed completely to do their job. They've just completely failed. And so it wouldn't take long. It wouldn't take more than one decision to put this into play again, for the court to just do the right thing and say to the legislature, you must comply with this provision. So I think it's great that we're going to have a clarification of this that's going to actually lay it out even more clearly than it is already laid out, because it's really pointing to the truth, which is that our courts have knowingly and intentionally allowed violations of our Constitution to protect the political interests of whoever they think is important. And this should never be tolerated, ever. It should never be tolerated. But again, when you say people don't get, how do you get standing and who gets to challenge it? And especially when you know that it's going to go nowhere, because as long as we have a court that refuses to actually follow the Constitution, it's futile. It's literally a futile effort, right?
So Senator Cal Bahr, who served with me in the Minnesota House, has been a champion on strengthening the single subject clause of our Constitution. And his latest bill that was introduced in this legislative biennium, so the bill is still live, and obviously it hasn't passed yet, but in the bill, it actually strengthens the standing restriction that people have faced. So it says a Minnesota resident may bring an action alleging a violation of the section in district court without needing to demonstrate direct injury. So it's kind of making it clear that anybody can sue because of this. Now, in order to sue to overturn an omnibus bill, it's very expensive. It could be $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 to go through all this process. So only certain groups have been able to afford to try to overturn these things. And so it hasn't been, consistently challenged. But this amendment that he's proposing also doesn't just address multi-subject omnibus bills. It addresses a very little-known type of bill called a vehicle bill, which I want to explain to the listeners what that is. A vehicle bill. So the Constitution says that a bill has to be introduced and read on the House floor on 3 different days. So you introduce a bill, and that's in order to get public awareness of what's going on, so that they can come up and testify. And so the legislators will introduce bills that serve basically no purpose but to be assigned a committee, to be gavelled through, to be voted yes on, even though they don't do much. And then it travels to the House floor and it waits at the finish line, having met all of the check the boxes on everything. And it's like one of them that I read a few years ago was a bill for an act requiring reports on legislative bills or something, some very generic thing. It passed through committee, got to the finish line, and it waited so that the legislators could then amend thousands of pages of legislation onto that bill of new legislation that had never been heard in committee. But because that bill number has passed all the stops, it could still pass without having to suspend the rules to have a super majority for an emergency to pass legislation. So in other words, it's a complete bypassing of the legislative process, in that both parties, Republicans and Democrats, do this when they're in the majority in order to get things across the finish line.
Well, Jeremy, I want to just make a quick comment, because this last session we had this sort of very interesting power sharing agreement where we had kind of this pretend idea that everybody was working together, and how that ended up playing out at the end. And I know we had some legislators post some very serious concerns about the fact that at the end we get to the omnibus bills, and we have a group of very small, 5-6 people that sit together in a room and then come out of that room and basically say to each of their parties, you will vote for this. And they don't even know what's in it. It's just, you're going to vote for it because we said so. Like that, those people are like the parents, threatening to take away your car keys if you don't listen to them.
The same thing happens in Congress, where they are given legislation that they're supposed to be voting on without enough time to read the bills. And I told my leadership when I was in St. Paul, or I called them management, I'm an automatic no unless I have time to read the bill and call my constituents to talk about issues with address their concerns. And that's how it should be for all legislators. They gave us a bill that was 1,000 pages long that we had to vote on in 3 hours. And you can't even read that bill in 3 hours. And there were like dozens of pages of just, they call them repealers. So instead of writing the entire legislation on there, you might be repealing law, crossing off existing law, and it's just literally like 30 characters long, but you go to look at it and it's 40 pages of legislation, of statute that it's striking, and you have to kind of cross-reference stuff. It's a mess. And not giving people enough time to read this is not an excuse. It's just bad governing, and the lobbyists and everybody else just loves this cramming through stuff at the last minute, because that's how they get their handouts and everything else, all the bad legislation that shouldn't pass. This
Jeremy,
is where we hear Nancy Pelosi's, let's pass it to see what's in it.
I can guarantee you, if any news desk in the country would take one of these bills and start to read it to people, right, and show it to people, the length, the hundreds of pages, it would be the best thing they could do to show people how our government doesn't work when it does this. It's so confusing. Even if they gave you 2 hours, 3 hours, 3 days to read it, it's almost impossible. So I think I'm really looking forward to seeing how this progresses, and hopefully we're going to be able to get people educated over the next, 8-9 months about the importance of this amendment that's coming forward. As we head into break, I would just want to thank everybody for listening to Political Pitchforks. We'll be back in a few minutes to discuss a new law that puts vulnerable kids in harm's way at the direction of the DFL trifecta.
Okay, let's begin.
Welcome back, Patriot listeners. This is Susan Shogren Smith here with Jeremy Munson on Political Pitchforks. So, Jeremy, we just had a great discussion about the problems with omnibus bills. Now I'd like us to wade into what happens when emotions and political rhetoric are used to influence the passage of laws in Minnesota.
Yeah, well, for those of you who kind of got upset in the last segment about omnibus bills and vehicle bills, Um, you probably won't like this segment either because we're going to talk about emotional legislating. But before we jump into that, Bill, I want to just say if you want to get involved in this push for strengthening the single subject clause of our Constitution, you know reach out to your legislator and tell them that you support Senate File 1097, which is that Cal Bahr's bill. You can find the information on politicalpitchforks.com. We'll post links to the bill. Also, the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, which can be found at gunowners.mn and on the Political Pitchforks website, they are currently in the middle of a lawsuit challenging a multi-subject omnibus bill from the previous session. And because in the tax bill, they put a anti-gun provision in that bill. And so they're challenging it because, you know, the tax bill shouldn't be regulating guns. And this is the binary trigger ban. So they're challenging it based on that. So you can go out to their website and find information on that lawsuit. Again, this is a lawsuit. You may not support gun rights, you may, but if you support the single subject clause of our Constitution, this is a lawsuit that you should support. On the emotional legislative front, there was a bill that was passed in 2024, so last year. It is called the Minnesota African American Family Preservation Act. And emotionally, it sounds great. You want to preserve African American families, make sure that you keep the family together. The problem here is that the problem that came to the legislature was that social services, child welfare, is taking Black children out of homes at a disproportionate rate compared to white children. Okay, if Black people make up 17% of the Minnesota population, maybe 40% of the children that are being taken into child protective custody were Black. And to address this percentage, this disparity, looking through the lens of race, the legislature said we should only be taking 17% of Black children out of their homes if Black families are 17% of the population. Okay, which I believe is a bad assumption. But the way that this legislation reads is that every year they have to make sure go back and change their internal rules on when they take children out of the home to make sure they preserve this percentage, that it's not a disparity. And the end result of this bill, of course, is that if you have a Black child and a white child that are being equally abused in their houses, that they're going to protect white children before Black children if the percentage of Black children are being taken out of their homes is too high. Does that make sense to you?
So nothing about this makes sense to me, partly because this law was modeled on an act, a similar act in law, federal law, called the Indian Child Welfare Act. And many of the provisions of this are taken from that act, which sounds great. And there are provisions of it that really would be kind of the gold standard. But when you get down to the application of the law, what really happens is it's a highly politicized process that puts people in the system on notice that at any moment an advocacy group can come forward and make all kinds of allegations about what you're not doing things right. And it really results in children who are affected by these laws being caught in a political war that has nothing to do with their best interests at all. And so, for example, this statute defines what is an African American child. Who is that? Well, African American child is a child having origins in Africa, including a child of two or more races who has at least one parent with origins in Africa. Whether a child or parent has origins in Africa is based upon self-identification or identification of the child's origins by the parent or guardian. So in essence, it can be implemented at any moment by either parent. It may or may not be true because it's self-identifying, and we're turning mere facts into opinions like gender. It's the same kind of idea, right? And like in ICWA, you could have a child who is biracial, and we don't know about percentages. You could have had a great ancestor, whoever from Africa, and other than that, maybe you're Asian, or maybe, who knows? Any could be any, but yet, if somebody self-identifies, then this law applies, which then will affect whether or not that child will be able to move towards permanency and adoption, which every study in the world says permanency, meaning adoption, is the best outcome. this law will inhibit the ability of a child to be adopted, to be able to say to their new friends at a school, this is my mom or dad. They can't really say that because they can't be adopted. So their entire life becomes an inability, and often embarrassing because kids they don't belong to a family. And so I just, Jeremy, you're right. This is emotional legislation.
It's a horrible bill. You pointed out some other laws that influence it because now you can just feel like you're black, and then you're black. There was a bill that was passed in the last legislative session, two sessions ago, that if you braid your hair in cornrows, that makes you black by law because you identify
Right.
as that
The Crown
culture.
Act. The Crown Act.
But the bottom line here is that you have a whole group of government officials whose job it is to protect children from abusive households. Now having to say, well, normally I would have taken this child out of the household, but because they're black and because we've met our quota for black children this month, we're not going to protect this child, but we're going to go over here and protect a white child who's in the exact same situation because of the color of their skin. That is wrong. It's against the Constitution to treat people differently. And this is what this bill does. This bill was authored by a whole bunch of Democrats in the Senate and a whole bunch of Democrats in the House, plus Walter Hudson, who's a Republican. He was an author on this bill. And the House that passed the House 117-5. Only 5 legislators voted against this in the House. 23 senators, almost 2/3 of the Republicans voted against this in the Senate. But it was a terrible, terrible, terrible bill. I serve on the board of the Legislative Evaluation Assembly. You can find it at lea-mn.org. We'll put a link on our site too to the scorecard that goes into more details on this bill. But it was a bad bill. And this was an example of emotional legislating. It was a single subject bill, although it's, I think, 120 pages long, but it's all based on one subject. It is being phased in over several years. The first portion has already been phased in. They have to create this kind of standard and figure out what the percentages are for each race, each child, because it's not just African American. It applies to any non-white child. Right. But it's being implemented more and more every year. I think it goes into full effect in 2027.
Well, one more thing I just want to comment on is the courts are required to look at the best interest of a child. And that has to do with the best interest of the child specifically. And one of the problems with the issue of this language, for example, it says that the best interest of an African American or disproportionately represented child means providing a culturally informed practice lens that acknowledges blah, 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 the child's culture, including the best interest of that child being related to how the child feels like they belong. Well, here's the problem. When children are raised in an environment that is abusive and includes neglect and harm, and then that's all that child knows, which most people who haven't grown up in those environments would say that's not ideal for a child. It's certainly not in a child's best interest to grow up there. I just want to tell a quick anecdote. A couple of years ago, I had a very interesting talk about this specific issue and whether or not children should be allowed to be present when their family is using drugs or engaging in these kind of behaviors. And I was told, well, Susan, you can't judge that because that's family. That's just family. And we just got to let kids be a part of their family and take the good with the bad. Well, just a mere few weeks later, that person's teenage child overdosed on drugs, right? He was a teenager, and he overdosed on drugs. And I'm just going to say, when we as a society have to decide what is a culture of a family or what is a culture, and if that culture has to be supported and approved by all of us, because there's no way for us to get at the cultural issues that are problematic because it's all lumped together as something that we have to support and accept. And no child should be living in a home where they're faced and confronted with these issues of abuse, neglect, drug addiction, threats, violence, etc. And I don't care what your heritage is, your ethnic background, your culture. It's just wrong for these kids to be put in these situations. So I hope that we have a lot more discussion as a community in Minnesota about whether or not this should be allowed. I want to thank our listeners for joining us on Political Pitchforks. Again, this is a new program on AM 1280 The Patriot. Political Pitchforks will be airing every Saturday morning from 9 to 10 a.m., where we will be bringing some controversial issues. We are going to be unafraid to talk about things that might upset some of you, and we are going to welcome your feedback. Please go to our website, politicalpitchforks.com, for more information. And I really want to thank Jeremy Munson for being a part of the programming and adding his insight. It's incredibly helpful. Thank you very much.